works at. I'm sure it's in the works.
All right. So I think we're recording. It's about 3 minutes in. I think we can go ahead and get started here. Real quick before we hop into it, my name is Jeremy. I'm a senior staff experience architect at G Aviation, and today we're going to be talking with Komal Narwani from. She's a chief marketing and product officer at Weavit. We're going to be talking about how do we prioritize UX in the chaos of early stage product building. But before we kick it off, a couple of things real quick. ADP list. We're a global community. We're based on genuine connections, and our mission is to foster an inclusive space and support network for designers to come together, learn from each other, and strive to be better. And this is just a few of the logos of some of the awesome mentors that we have on ADP list. So if you're out there and you haven't signed up for a session yet, please by all means check out ADP list. I got some awesome mentors. Myself and Komal being one of them, but there's a ton more. Here's some community milestones. We've got 3,000 mentors. We've got 12,000 one-on-one sessions, 100 plus events, over 70 countries, which is pretty awesome. A couple of event guidelines. We're recording. I don't know if you guys heard the little thing a second ago. We're recording, so by attending, you grant your consent. We're going to post this on YouTube later. So, no hate speech. Obviously, discriminatory behavior is not tolerated at all. We'll take a group selfie. So, if you want, turn your camera on. And we'd love it if later on after this, you could post some key takeaways on social media and make sure you tag us with at ADP list and hashtag tech hustle. That'd be awesome. And that way we know. We can give us some feedback and stuff. We'd love to hear it. I think that's everything for that. So I'll stop sharing real quick. So I'm going to quickly just introduce Komal. She's an entrepreneur at heart. She's a traveler in her soul. She's a driven professional who's always eager to discover faster routes to create value for individuals and greater society. She has experience in marketing, strategy, product design, branding, product strategy and analytics, and business innovation. So I'm really excited today to talk to Komal. So Komal, welcome to Tech Hustle. It's awesome to have you today.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, I kind of did like a little bit of a brain dump when I was talking a bit about the kind of stuff I've worked on in the past. This is really cool to be here. So Felix from ADP List, thank you so much for making this a possibility for people around the world. It's a very, very cool venture. And I think you've created tons of value for people around the globe who are looking to get into design. So thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah. So Jeremy, I'll let you kick it off with some
Yeah, for sure.
questions.
For sure. So I'm curious, before we sort of jump into it, let's talk a little bit about your background and your experience and how you've gotten to where you are. So product officer, C-level, sweet. That's a pretty awesome. Talk a little bit about your experience, how you got there, and maybe like some various, enterprise versus startup and things like that. Maybe, how they're different, because I
Sure.
want to get into the startup stuff, but maybe we can
Sure,
conceptualize.
sure. So actually, I mean, I'm born and raised in Hong Kong as an Indian, so I'm a bit of a third culture kid. Been a little bit strewn into the deep end of culture and had like a bit of a mixture of exposure to different cultures my whole life. Also, when I say entrepreneur at heart, it's because I come from a lineage of self-starters, and most of the people in my family have, made money by starting their own businesses, made a living from doing that. So I've always had that, I think, in my blood. Not unlike many other people out there as well. For me, my journey in my career stems back to post high school, where I started reselling tickets and mobile phones as a means of making some side cash, and then went into university and started a promotional products business at first, and that's kind of where I built a little bit of my initial savings to start a business or to bootstrap a business. And then I moved to Beijing for a good 5 years. And when I first moved to Beijing, I was in hospitality and in marketing. But then quickly realized I had an itch to do my own thing again. So I started a design studio in Beijing, which was pretty nascent at that point for design studios, and started to do branding and marketing strategy and product design for companies in hospitality and in luxury, and started to stem out a little bit into working with companies like Air China, Four Seasons, Swire Properties, which has a pretty large presence in Asia. And from that as well, got a bit more stature in working with companies, both large and small, in marketing strategy, product strategy. To fast forward a little bit, I came back to Hong Kong in 2019, where I started to work at a consultancy. And from there, got a lot more exposure working with larger scale enterprises on digital transformation projects. And from there, I had, met the founder of the startup I'm working at today, and we decided to partner and build Weavit, which is where how I got to where I am today. I also think that having the C title in a early stage startup is just a title. It doesn't mean much. It just means that you have more responsibility, in fact, of getting shit done, basically.
Yeah, hopefully more equity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, but in
So
exchange for responsibility.
there you go. So let's talk a little bit
Yes.
about this idea of fast pace UX
Yeah.
startup.
Yeah.
How does this, in your view, how does that fast pace, the first initial stages, differ from maybe a more established company or even enterprise, perhaps? Or talk a little bit about that.
Sure. That's a great question. So essentially, I feel the big difference between larger scale enterprises and a early stage startup is time and resources. Early stage startups very often don't have the cushioning or the padding that larger companies do in terms of, kind of spanning or expanding the discovery phases, or everybody in UX says the best way to approach it is to spend more time in the problem space, but very often as a startup you don't have
Mm.
endless amounts of time to spend in the problem space. So I think that's a huge differentiator. The mindset should be the same, but you should be a lot more mindful of the fact that you have limited resources and time in a startup versus a larger company.
Yeah. So when we were talking the other day, you
Yeah.
mentioned these overall. You had three ideas, three big key points. Talk about those because I found those really intriguing. And it's kind of a shame. I think larger companies and enterprises and more established startups can probably take away from these ideas. But talk about those three ideas if you don't mind. I'd love to explore those a little bit further.
Which specific three ideas are you referring to?
So we were talking about competitive landscape, right? The
Yeah.
idea of stakeholders, empathy for your stakeholders, and then this last one of how your users sort of change over time, or your idea of
Yes, yes,
users sort of
yes,
change over time.
exactly. So, yeah, so typically, obviously, when you're using UX to approach problem solving, which is essentially what it is, like empathizing with your end user and trying to solve a problem for them in the best way you possibly can. I feel like in a startup, there's a lot more chaos because you are not only dealing with the user themselves, but you're also dealing with stakeholders who are usually under high pressure to deliver something quickly to the market. The third thing as well that is pretty important, like you just mentioned, is the competitive landscape. Because it's so fast paced, because you may have finite resources, but the other early stage startup, maybe in another geography or in another industry that could be tapping into the same market, they could have a completely different
Mm-hmm.
cap table and could have a lot more money to play with. You're dealing with people who are moving a lot faster than you, with bigger teams, with bigger engineering teams, bigger marketing teams, bigger marketing budgets. So I think that is kind of the big picture of how these three different aspects contribute to the chaos of an early stage startup. And
Yeah.
typically, when UX tells you to focus specifically on user needs, sometimes you need to make sure you take into consideration there are two other giant factors when you're working in an early stage startup, which is once again stemming back to time and resources.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Let's explore that idea a little bit. Like, how do you manage that? So everybody on this call hopefully is familiar with the agile method for delivering software, right? Tinkering, you do a little thing, you release, you see how it works, you do a little thing, you change it, you see how that worked, and then you get you end up eventually with the ideal product. To me, it sounds like all three of those things could potentially be have a benefit from if UX took that agile approach as opposed to maybe I don't know, let's go research this thing for 6 months or a year, and then we'll design a full scale prototype, and we'll test it and make sure it works. And if it doesn't work, we'll redo the prototype. And 2 years from now, we'll have the perfect product. It doesn't sound like
Yeah.
that's possible in this environment. So, how do you manipulate that environment to your advantage?
Firstly, I don't think that you're ever really going to have the perfect product, right? Because perfection is also like a state of mind. It's very momentary, and in a few moments or tomorrow, circumstances and the environment changes. It changes so fast that all of a sudden your product can always be a little bit better to tap into more of the market. But coming back to what you were talking about, which is agile. So the way I see it is a little bit more people always try to find the intersection between doing the right things versus doing things right, right? And agile, I feel, is very synchronous with the doing things right because it's more process oriented and allows you to like keep things on track, to be able to measure cadence and so on. This is where Scrum Master comes in and all the other roles and ceremonies come into play. But then doing the right thing is a little bit more where like the lean startup mindset comes in, where you build, measure, learn, you have that loop.
Mm-hmm.
So to ask how I kind of manipulate these processes to my advantage, well, I mean, our team also had a little bit of let's say, a journey to find the right way of doing things. And I still think that we're on our way to find the best way of doing things. As you scale up or you scale down to a smaller team, you always have to adjust. I do think that there are three big types of frameworks at play. One is design thinking, which is a lot more about a mindset, more about empathizing, more about designing a prototype to test. And I do think that this is a lot more in the opportunity space. This is before you start a startup.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you already jump into the early stage startup space, you kind of leverage the UX methodology of kind of lean startup. And then as you start to scale a little bit more, you build a more complex product. That's when agile comes really into play because
Yeah.
then you start to scale up your dev team and you need to have these frameworks in place so that you can really start to measure everybody's cadence and the outcome so that nobody shoots me for saying the word output, but output sometimes is a little bit important because we shouldn't be asleep while we're
Yeah,
working.
absolutely. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we talked a little bit about this idea of stakeholders. And to me, when you think of stakeholders, the first thing that might come to mind, the people paying you, the people, investors, things like that. But what I think when I hear the word stakeholders, it's more broad than that. The stakeholders could be the product team that have a stake in delivering it on a certain time. It could be the engineering team who's got a stake in building it the right way, making sure it's performant and secure and things like that. So when we talk about stakeholders, understanding their background and where they're coming from, things like that. What are some ideas there, and how to leverage that relationship or something maybe to build and release and build and release and test and release and instead of this long drawn out research process perhaps.
So, I mean, what it comes down to as well is, we spoke about the fact that UX is very much just a mindset to approaching people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And stakeholders are people, and stakeholders are essentially, well, by definition, it's any person with an interest or concern in a project or in a business. So that could be potential users, that can be competitors as well, it can be investors, shareholders, the founders themselves, of course, but also the team, both internal and external suppliers that help to deliver value. So when I was actually thinking about this topic and this subject matter about how to prioritize UX in the chaos of early stage startup building, is because sometimes we're so fixated on the process that is associated with UX that we kind of forget that it's actually just about understanding people. And people in a small startup range from the team who are executing themselves to the founders who have their own needs and their own pain points that need to be addressed, and also potential users. So I feel like it's quite challenging because when I say prioritizing UX, it's also practicing or prioritizing understanding the individuals around you and all the things that they are, trying to deal with at the same time. So if you have a founder, they're trying to deal with funding, they're trying to understand how to reach their bottom line as well as generate revenue so that the investors that they've taken hard earned money from can get a quick return on investment for what they've
Mm-hmm.
believed in. And the team as well, they need to build something that has stature, that has value, that is able to create value for them as well. Some people are juniors that join startups, and you have to be able to empathize with the fact that this is one of their first or second projects or companies on their CV. You need to make sure that it's also worth their while from a learning experience, but also from a product perspective. And then, of course, the most important driver of every startup is your potential user base, right? They're the ones who pay the bills at the end of the day. So that's the big one. That's the most obvious one. But I think in an early stage startup, when the team is small, there are a lot more stakeholders that are involved and that drive the needle on what you should be prioritizing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a book by Tom Griever that I would recommend everybody in this call read. It's called Articulating Design Decisions. And there's a large portion of the book, a chapter or two chapters devoted to empathy. And it's so interesting, as UX designers, we always think we have empathy for our users and empathy for our users and blah blah blah. We talk about empathy, and I've seen this so often where we don't have any empathy for the people we work with. So we're fighting with the product team. Oh, they always ask me for this, but we have a process. You mentioned, it's funny because you mentioned process almost like as gospel, like we have to do this or we're not a real UX team. Same with agile, right? We have to follow these things. But though we don't have empathy for them, like, why are they asking us for this? What is the reasoning for this? There's probably some overall business goal that they're trying to reach. One of the things that Tom mentions in the book, which I found fascinating, I had never even crossed my mind to do this, was creating user stories for your team so that you can help to understand where they're coming from. So for instance, like as a founder, I want to something so that I can something, right? So like as a founder,
Yep.
I want to have something so that I can present something to make money or get money or invest, whatever it is. I don't really work with
Yep.
founders that much. So I have no idea what the founders actually do. But so in that case, help like having these stories and then sharing that with your team, your UX team, can actually help you. Like maybe there's an opportunity for you to help do something for a founder so that they can get more money and maybe you can grow the team or maybe you can if you can afford to go on research trips or whatever. So it's a really fascinating idea. If anybody out there hasn't read that book, I would highly recommend Tom Griever's book. um,
Nice.
I'm curious from your perspective, what's worked for you to help build that empathy? Have you done any kind of exercises or maybe just one-on-ones or I don't know, any thoughts there?
So what I do with the team, which I find very very useful, is I use Google's team framework, where they talk about evaluating psychological safety, meaning, impact, dependability as well, which is huge. And I just feel like it's worked really well. And team members give their score on a 5-point ranking. And we kind of look at it over time to see what has changed in the last 2 weeks. That goes as well with Rosebud and Thorn as a means of kind of auditing what happened in the last couple of weeks, and improving on that. But I think that you bring up a very important point, that because you're in an early stage startup, every single individual is very pivotal to the output of the outcomes that you achieve as a company.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to understand everyone's motivation, their underlying motivations as well as their external motivations, and that really helps a lot to reduce the friction between people, so you can actually move faster and get things done. Because time is really, I mean, I fundamentally believe time is just of the essence of any early stage startup.
Yeah.
You don't move quickly, you're going to pass at some point.
Someone will pass you up. Yeah. So when
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned psychological safety actually, because when we talk about the competitive landscape and how you have to move fast, psychological safety seems so important there, right? I need to make a decision. I need to make a decision fast, and I can't worry about making the wrong decision and being blamed for it or being, fired because of it or whatever. You build that culture of reprisals and people getting in trouble for making decisions when they thought they were making the right decision. You're going to end up people not making decisions and you're going to be sitting still. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about this idea of psychological safety, and how that helps when we start talking about this early stage competitive landscape. I got to move. I got to be fast. I got to make decisions quickly. Um, I don't know. Can you expand on that a little bit? I love to dive into that.
That's That's super interesting because as a founder of a early stage startup, I care a lot about the culture part. And having been born and raised in Hong Kong, I've been exposed to so many different cultures that you see really significant differences between how people maybe from the US behave to certain or act in certain situations to people from Europe to people who are born and raised in Hong Kong. There is a very different way that people approach work. I don't know if you are aware of Hofstede. Hofstede has his cultural dimensions where he talks about power distance
Okay.
and three other facets of it as well,
Absolutely.
closeness and this tribal side of teams. And I think it's really important because that's one element to take into consideration, just cultural differences
Mhm.
as a way of understanding people. And then the second one is, of course, understanding people's responsibilities and creating a safe space and that's exactly why in a startup process, too much focus on process, I think, is not the right approach because the more you focus on process and the way things were done, or by copying competitors because you're too afraid to really innovate, I think that's kind of where the problem lies. And that's maybe why sometimes startups really fail to create this compelling value proposition because they don't dare to take a risk. And
Mhm.
if you don't dare to take a risk, it all falls in line under the same umbrella. You don't take responsibility for when you fail. But I find that surprising because we're in a culture today where you're almost celebrated if you fail. So
Right. Right.
why aren't more people,
Fail
failing?
fast, fail
But
often. Yeah.
exactly. So I think that that's a little bit a better approach, even in terms of UX for an early stage startup. But that does differ a lot when you scale up and when you join a bigger organization, because over there, failure may have larger repercussions and ripple effects across the organization.
Yeah.
But in a startup, you have a blessing of being able to try, and you have a sandbox, and you can do whatever you want to meet the needs of your customers, of course.
Yeah. So, it's funny you
Yeah,
mentioned the idea this fail fast, and we talked about failing is celebrated. What I think it's funny because what we celebrate is the failing, but what we're really supposed to be celebrating is the learning from the failure,
yeah,
not the failure.
yeah,
We
yeah,
failed and we understood why we failed so that next time we don't fail.
yeah,
And we made a change.
exactly.
We're celebrating the fact. I guess, like, it comes back maybe to psychological safety. There is we're making it okay to fail. We're making it okay to try something new and fail.
Yeah, yeah,
But hopefully what we're trying to learn from there is like the learning from that, and then not committing that again, and then failing twice for the same reason, failing often for different reasons each time.
yes.
I
I
read a
mean,
blog
that's why
post.
there's this. Yeah, go
Go ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I read a blog post recently. A woman named Artie Karai from a company called Industrial Logic in Canada, and they are a consultancy. They help digital transformation, agile transformation, and she came up with this concept. We always talk about MVP, right? And it's interesting because I am curious. I want to get your thoughts on this as well because when we talk about competitive landscape. This is something that I think is interesting. But when we talk about MVP, everybody I think hears the term minimum, and what often people miss is the term viable, right? And when they
Mhm.
think of minimum, they think of what's the least I can build? What's the least
Yeah,
amount of money I can spend? Instead of thinking what's the least amount of things that we can do to make a viable product for a user to actually get some minimum value out of, as opposed to no value at all.
yeah,
And so this minimum concept, MVP, is constantly, I think, misconstrued by many teams. Many people have different ideas of what MVP means. And so instead of using the term minimum, what Artie recommends is using the terms earning release and learning release, right? So we have a learning release
Mhm.
where our whole point
Yeah,
is to not make any money this release. The whole point is to understand if we're doing the right thing and we should keep moving forward or pivot and change it and do something different. And so maybe your
yeah,
release is every 2 weeks, maybe your release is once a month, whatever. But your learning
yeah,
release comes before your earning release so that you can understand what to do to fix it so that the next release will make you some money. And I'm kind of
yeah.
curious your ideas there, your thoughts when we talk about competitive landscape changing fast, failing often, things like that. This idea of MVP, this idea of maybe learning, earning. I don't know. How do you feel about that? What's your thoughts on MVP and stuff like that?
So I think in theory, of course, it's It's a very good mindset to have, right? When people are really, I mean, building products and they're dealing with larger sums of money, for example, when it comes to using that on developers or in a design team, it's not always easy to forgive this releasing very quickly, even though you know it might not be perfect, and just quickly iterate. And even if you fail, you can just pivot, because at some point people want to get that validation, that return on idea, that return on initiative as well. So I think in terms of mindset, theoretically, it's great. And I think we should all work towards that, because it's a tough mindset to get into, but I think it's really, really fundamental, because that's the entire thing that Agile is built on, trial and error, and constantly having this loop, like a telephone cord. Um, but but I think what you're talking about is the learning release, and then the earning release is a bit similar to having a private beta or having an MVP out in like a little cohort that you're testing with, and then having a minimum lovable product. So the MLP is a little more interesting, is because when you have the minimum amount of features, the minimum amount of like solution related propositions that users love, they're willing to exchange their actual money for what you're providing to them. So I think that's a little bit similar to what you're talking about. And that's maybe what we're working towards right now, where you realize you release your MVP, nobody really likes it. Very often, no one really, well, some people like your MVP, they believe in it, but most people tell you what's wrong with it so that you can fix it, and then build something that's better for the market.
And then you have people who complain about it for the next 10 years that they loved it the way it was 10 years ago and they wish you could.
Exactly. And you
So,
realize that maybe they're 80 years old, so oh well.
yeah. All right. So, this actually ties into the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of understanding who your users are. Right. And one of the things that you mentioned, we were chatting a little bit yesterday, was this idea that your users evolve, or your not the users evolve, your idea of who your users are evolve over time. So I guess let's talk maybe about that, because I think that ties a little bit to your MVP, and seeing who those people are, what worked, what didn't, and maybe a few years down the road you realize, oh my god, we had the wrong target audience from the beginning. So talk about that in your experience there, and maybe I don't know. I'd love to hear like an anecdote. Is there something like that you remember you had a persona built or something, and you realize like, oh my god, this is totally wrong. Anyway, I don't talk a little bit about that. I think we could.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So when we first started Weavit, we wanted to be a bit of a like a personal CRM, a cross between a personal CRM and also like an artificial intelligence app. We were doing lots of different things. We were convinced that we're at the intersection of this brand new niche of markets, that's where we got our TAM, our DAM, and the addressable market that we put on our pitch deck. And then of course we realized that we were trying to get all the core features from the best products in each of those different markets and deliver them in one product, thinking that's the way to do it. Obviously, that's absolutely not the right way to do it. So what we realized after we released our product in private beta is that, of course, not a lot of people were using it, because there was not one critical path for our target user that was fulfilled with our product. And I think that's the most important thing. Try to focus on one critical journey that your user needs to go through to basically solve their pain point. And I think that's a much better way to actually approach building your product and finding your target audience. And in discovering more about the different journeys that users go through, we started to spend more time in the problem space, in the industry, looking at competitors. And I think we unearthed maybe 40 competitors that we realized were doing something very similar to what we were doing that we never even heard of before. And we were like, what were we doing prior to launching the startup? So many people are actually doing something very, very similar. So I think that coming back to your question of, how do you find your perfect target user? I think that constantly evolves over time as you start to craft out the persona and you try to craft out the identity of the individual you're looking for. And I think what helps is to really, okay, in this respect, spend more time going deeper in the problem space, so you can look at competitors and understand the marketplace a little bit better.
Okay. So you mentioned
Yeah.
something I want to explore a little bit. You said, we thought we were going to go big and do this full price suite, and you said obviously that's not the right way. What happened there? Was there an event? Was there some usability study or feedback that you got from somebody at some point that made you rethink the whole thing and realize it was totally wrong?
Sometimes when you're building something, you know it may not be the right thing to do, but there are influences, either stakeholders, either, there's a sunk cost fallacy where you don't want to revert from the money that you've spent already and the time you spent. I think that's a huge reason why people don't pivot faster.
Mm.
And I think that is essentially what happened with us as well. But we learned our lesson. Um, and we're still learning our lesson, of course, as we pivot and we start to launch Weavit on the App Store in about a month and a half, but with a very clear value proposition that's completely different to what it was before. That even if you have this slight conviction about something, I mean, if you have a bit of doubt, that's the phrase. If you have some doubt, there is actually no doubt. So there's a reason why you have that doubt in the first place. So take it into consideration, especially when it comes to an early stage startup, because you should pivot early and often so that you can quickly jump on the right path. Because, like I said earlier, resources are limited.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So the idea there, I guess, is that if you have doubt, then you are on the right path. Like kind of that idea, like a Socratic ignorance, I guess. Like if you think you know everything, you clearly don't. In this case, if
Exactly.
you have no doubts, then something is wrong because there's something there. Is that's kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you should always be a little bit like tread carefully into the market. You should be a little bit more aware of everything around you, your competitors. You should always not always second guess yourself, I think, in a startup, because you should move forward with confidence and with conviction as well. Especially if you're trying to find product market fit and you would like to find a community of users, you need to have that confidence in your vision and your story and that compelling end goal. But I do think that you shouldn't be ignorant to the fact that there could be many other ways of doing or achieving the value that you're trying to put out there, to put it shortly.
Right. Yeah. All right. So the last thing I want to kind of explore is this idea of UX maturity, right? So at a startup, I guess maybe I'm like generalizing, but generally I would assume most startups tend to be more focused on the user, more accepting of UX, processes, best practices, or something like that, as opposed to enterprise, which might have, zero UX maturity at all. They might not even understand what UX means in any way. So I'm curious, from your perspective, this idea of UX maturity in different companies, everybody kind of has a different approach. So anybody out there who isn't familiar, the Nielsen Norman Group scale, 1 through 6, I think it is, of the UX maturity. Um, so I'm curious just about that in general, your experience. How does that play into what you're able to create as the director of product or the chief product officer?
So it's funny that you say that enterprises don't really have a lot of UX maturity, because the kind of understated assumption is that enterprises are expected to have more UX maturity than an early stage startup.
Not my
But I
experience.
do think, yeah.
Not my work.
And that's very interesting, because I've had lots of discussions with colleagues or other individuals who are in early stage startups who used to maybe work at enterprises
Mm.
and then point out all the holes in a
Wow.
early stage startups UX maturity.
Yeah.
But the truth is, you don't have the cushioning or the padding to think about all the different elements that comprise UX maturity, such
Mm-hmm.
as training stakeholders' mindsets, such as implementing all the right tactics, and so on, and all the right processes. Sometimes you just have to move. You have to move quickly. Sometimes it's quick and dirty, but if you have the right strategy in place, then and the right tactics in your toolbox, then it ends up working out pretty well. So from your question, which was how does UX maturity play into it? I think it comes down to the individual in an early stage startup. But in an enterprise, it really comes down to the organization, because you need a very strong leadership as you bring people in. You have to start to trickle down training to middle managers, and then to new associates and new hires. Whereas in an early stage startup, I think you should build together a band of team, or a team that has a strong UX mindset already from the get go. So actually, I feel, even though Nielsen Norman's group and their work is exceptional, I feel like that those 6 stages of UX maturity don't really apply to a startup, honestly, because
Yeah.
it's kind of expected anyways. You've created the startup because you're already user centric enough to realize that there's a pain that needs to be solved, and that's why
Mm-hmm.
you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. This is maybe the places that I've worked, but what I've seen, I guess at least in the enterprise space, is that these teams, these software teams, have been around for a long time, 20, 30 years, right? They've been building software since the late 80s, early 90s, back when it was mainframes and green screens with Komal and all these,
Yeah.
like basically mainframe interfaces and stuff. And what they used to do a lot of times was they would just hire contractors, consultants to come in, give them a bunch of requirements, and then say, build this exactly how I want, and here's your money. See ya, thanks. And over time, with something like GE, like what we've realized, is that
Waterfall.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so what we've realized over time is that we're paying people, consultants, a lot of money. We could hire a team who's really smart and do this ourselves. And what
Yeah.
they tend to do is treat the employees as if they were just consultants. Here's a bunch of requirements now, and some benefits now. You get
Yeah.
vacation and stuff, but we expect it to be exactly as we told you. And thanks, see ya. And so you've got these software teams that come in, and it's interesting because you mentioned agile as gospel before, kind of this processes, we must follow the process. And these agile teams come in and say, whoa, 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 this is waterfall. No, man, we're going to do it different, man. Like all this like kind of new age software mindset.
Yeah.
And there's like this, again, fighting, fighting, fighting. And what I've found is that it comes back to this empathy that we talked about, where you understand where they're coming from. You could fight with them, or you could work with them. And maybe you don't get
Yeah.
pure agile. Maybe you don't get, the perfect UX process or whatever it is. But you get something better than what you had before. And
Yeah.
I guess the comparison I make to what I'm taking away from a lot of stuff you said is this idea of perfection is unattainable. You're never going to get perfection, and striving for perfection and letting that get in the way of the good enough for right now does nobody any good, right?
Yep.
You strive for
Exactly.
perfection. You strive for perfection, and you never release it because you took a year to research, you took a year to do your prototypes, or you fought with the engines. It wasn't pixel perfect, and it never got released.
Yeah.
What value did anybody get out of that work that you did? Right? It just sits sitting in, a box folder or OneDrive or whatever you use, and it does nobody any good. So I love that idea though, this empathy and not striving for perfection. And I think that would go for startup, enterprise, whatever. I think that's just a really great insight. So
And that's the thing. I think UX maturity should be judged a little bit more on. Again, from Nielsen Norman Group, they talked about what are the core skills that every UX leader needs.
mm-hmm.
Right. One big one is the ability to storytell. So can you use oration to like actually convert data into storytelling and really communicate that to the key stakeholders? And then the second is obviously presenting, upholding a vision for a company or for a product, or having like a core overarching strategy. The third one is, of course, alignment. Can you facilitate, and can you bring people to a room and kind of facilitate brainstorming, design sprints, and so on? And the last is, of course, critique. Can you stimulate also culture feedback? I
Mm-hmm.
do think that the irony is in large scale enterprises, when people are doing things in more of a waterfall manner, it's because they're not able to really communicate to the board or key stakeholders or key shareholders, that we should do things in a more experimentative way, and that it's okay to be wrong the first time. If they are able to facilitate, if they're able to communicate that and also implement a culture of feedback, we would be doing a lot less waterfall and a lot more, agile, or so to speak, trial and error. And
Yeah.
I think that's the cornerstone of UX maturity.
I love it. Yeah, no, that's awesome. It all goes back to this idea where I think where agile kind of came from. And it's funny. I heard Bob Martin speak some time ago, and for those who aren't aware, Bob Martin, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, he was at the ski lodge when they all signed their names on the thing. And one of the things that Bob Martin has said over and over again is he doesn't like the state of agile as it is today, because the agile was meant to be tinkering. It was meant to be just like playing with it and releasing and getting some feedback, playing with it. There wasn't Scrum Master, and Scrum and all this stuff is sort of seen, I think, as like equal one-to-one agile, but Scrum is just a method for which you are agile, right? So, Scrum certifications and Scrum Masters and all these Scrum ceremonies and daily stand-up and all these other things, retro and all those things. It was very much like a Scrum process gospel. We must follow the process. And one of the things that Bob Martin is very much against is that whole certification and following it. It's like, do what works for you. And if this process works for your team, so what if it's not agile? Like, who cares? Do what you
Yeah.
do, release something, as UX, and I think this is something Jared Spool mentions a lot, but I think this is something for the whole software team is, your goal, your job is to make someone's life better, hopefully by using your software. And that's something
Yeah.
I think the UX team can follow. I think that's something the product team should follow. That's something the development team should follow.
Yep.
And what method you use to get to that value, who cares? As long as you're getting value to your users. So anyway, I think all of this is awesome stuff. Anything else about this early stage UX chaos that you think we should talk
Yeah.
about? We haven't
I mean,
mentioned.
I think that, yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I mean, right at the beginning, which is one of the key differences between a early stage startup and an enterprise is the time constraint, right? And the resource constraint. That's a huge one. I think that as a early stage startup, your goal is very, very clear. You need to find product market fit somehow. So what does that mean really? There's a great graph that basically maps out the vision for your company and also the depth of customer engagement as a means to really understand where you sit in achieving product market fit. So when you have really deep customer engagement and you have a very compelling vision, they say that very often that leads to product market fit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you have a very compelling vision, but you have no one listening, you just have a sexy story without recognition and real potential to generate revenue. And if you do have deep customer engagement, but a very small vision or not very compelling vision, you are a little bit more revenue centric because you have users, but it's not really going to scale. It's not going to last for the long run. So I do think one thing people need to really realize is that whatever UX methodologies or processes or tactics or strategy you choose, there's three key goals, I think, for a early stage startup is you should have a very compelling story or vision. It has to be captivating. The second one is you need to have deep customer engagement. So that is a very good marker for adoption for your product or your service. And then the last one is just bear in mind, coming back to time and resources, that you need to achieve a quick ROI for the initial investment, both from a time and from a monetary perspective. So that's where speed really comes into play. So speed should really scope out what type of methodologies or tactics you use in getting to the value of the customer faster.
I love it.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, this is great.
All
So,
right. That's it.
yeah, no, this is awesome. I love it. So, competitive landscape, you got to be fast. You got to be able to make decisions quickly. Psychological safety is really important for that. Having empathy for your users but not just for your users, for your team as well is really important. Have a compelling story. Understand that you have your idea of who your users are could change over time as you iterate and release and test and all these things. So having a really strong engagement with your customers, I think, is the key to that. So this has been an awesome conversation. So we've got about 15 minutes left. Please add some questions for Komal in the chat. I've got a couple here that I'm going to start. You want to answer some questions? Do you have time to stick around for a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
All right, awesome.
And for you as well, Jeremy. I'm sure you've got
Oh,
great
no,
answers as well.
we're here for you, not me. All right, so let's see. I've got a couple here. Let's say your product caters to multiple target audiences. How do you prioritize what target persona to design for first?
That's a great question because we have a product that is exactly like that. Our product can cater to multiple target audiences. That's where, you have the DVF matrix, right? The desirability, viability, and feasibility. So obviously desirability, you can create a solution that caters to multiple different target audiences. For example, we're building a note-taking tool or a thought capture tool. Essentially, anyone on this planet has thoughts, so they could be a target user of our product, but how do we get even deeper? So there are different kind of characteristics and there's different types of thought capturers, people who'd like to connect information together, people who like to collect information, and people who are creators of information. Now, there's an umbrella of features that relate to knowledge creators or information creators. That's where word processing comes in, Microsoft Word or Craft. If you think about an iOS app that is amazing for creators on the go. And then for collectors, you or kind of information curators, you think of apps like Pinterest, you think of My Mind, you think of, other tools that help to kind of collate things together. They don't really intersect with one another, but they still address the same greater target audience.
Mhm.
So I think a key way to figure out which one to work on first is speak with your dev team about what type of features your infrastructure, your tech stack can actually support, because that is really important as well. Which
Mhm.
one is closest to your core value proposition and your mission statement, because that's where your viability, where your business comes into play. And then the last one is you got to make a decision on which sub persona you choose to target first. There is no exact answer on whether that's going to be the right one. And that's just taking a risk on picking which one fits more after you've done the other filtration methods.
Yeah. And then following up,
Yeah.
testing it, and making sure that you
Yes,
change it.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you
Yes.
mentioned something there I think is really important though, is like understanding your development capacity, or your ability to build one thing versus another. So,
Yeah.
that's something I think like a lot of UXers, they'll go off in their hole and then design and then hand it over and say, we're done, go build it, hope everything's pixel perfect. But, it's like we've been talking about it this whole time. You got to have that relationship with your engineering team, understand what they can do. You could
Yes.
design anything in the world. That doesn't mean they're going to be able to build it. What can they build first? What could they build second? Does something need to be built first so that it's a foundation for future features?
Yep.
Maybe we can do this thing now, and then maybe next release we could do something on top of that, and then that might cater to the second set of users. So I think that conversation is critical there, understanding what the development team can build. That's
Yep.
awesome. I love that idea.
Definitely.
All right, let's see. Here's a good one. I wonder, for designer founders, what things are essential to set the right tone and empathetic culture as the company and the design team grows? So how can you build that
Hmm.
culture? Scalable culture, I guess, would be.
Scalable culture. I think one of the big things, or one of the books that really changed my mindset towards certain things, is Radical Candor. I don't know if anyone's read that book, but it's about giving honest feedback in a very constructive way without being afraid that you're going to hurt somebody else's feelings. Because if you think you're going to hurt someone else's feelings, but you don't say anything and you have good feedback for that, that's actually doing a complete disservice to your team. So
Mhm.
it's about setting that tone for allowing people to give feedback to one another, and just reassuring everyone in the team as well that when they give feedback, it's completely not personal. This is completely about the product, and that we have a shared vision here to build something amazing. I'm not here to build something better than you or to get my point across. I think that's super important. It's the we versus I mindset. So I think that's kind of key to the way I've hoped to do things in any company I've started. It's more about we and us rather than you and I.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess in that case too, it might also change like where your company is located. And we talked a little bit before about
Yes.
psychological safety and also cultural differences across the team. The way
Yep.
that one team might want to work could be different if you're scaling up. Like, let's say you were in the Valley in San Francisco and you go to India perhaps to get a team. The way that team in California works is probably going to be very different from the way the team in India wants to work. And
Yeah.
so I guess that's something maybe also to keep in mind, is that idea. There's something really interesting. I thought this was funny. When GE, I work for GE, big global corporation. We have offices all over the world.
Yep.
Poland, India, Bangalore. We've got teams in Europe, Asia, all over the place, US obviously. And they would give the teams cultural classes on how to work with different locations. But they didn't give the team in the US one for some reason. So I remember when we worked with a team in Hungary for a while, and they had a class about Americans, and they were told Americans like to be complimented. We like to be told we're doing a good job. We like to be
Yeah.
thanked for our efforts and things like that. And so it's so funny because we didn't know they had this class, and they were all like, "Hey, great work, good job, thank you so much." And we're like, "I didn't do it. Like, what is going on?" And we found out they had a cultural class to learn about Americans. Anyway,
That's hilarious.
funny side story there. All right. Here's a good question that kind of goes with that. How would you reconcile cultural differences in a work environment if we're talking about, maybe we've got somebody in Silicon Valley versus and then a team in India? How do you, I don't know, maybe you haven't had that challenge before, but I'm curious, do you have any thoughts there?
I've had that challenge before multiple times actually, and I think there's yet to be, a Cards Against Humanity. I don't know if anyone's ever played that game, but there needs to be a game like that for coworkers to connect with one another,
It sounds like an
because
opportunity,
there's a
yeah.
lot of, yeah, that's a great opportunity actually. So anyone want to do that, talk to me about it after. But I think the key thing is to really understand the nuances. For an individual that cares more about the we and the us, you care a lot more about collaboration and about bringing people closer together rather than pulling them further apart and allowing them to build cliques within a company.
Yeah.
So I think the key thing is also to kind of recognize quickly what people's resistances are. Sometimes you have people who are more prone to high power distance environments. So when you ask them for their opinion, they're more reluctant to give it to you. And you try to kind of create more situations and circumstances and say, this is kind of an even playing field. It's just a role, it's just a title, it doesn't mean anything, where it's human to human here. And your opinion is equally as important as anyone else's, and I think that's really important. So understanding the nuances, giving people a lot more opportunities to express themselves and to tell you a little bit more about what they like, and connecting with them on that, connecting with them on what they like, what they dislike, and finding similarities. It's really an active individual effort
Hmm.
to reconcile cultural differences in a working environment. But I think it's super important in a startup
Yeah,
because you need to be very cohesive.
yeah, that might sound, it might be forced coming from the top. Maybe that has to be like an organic kind of
Yeah.
grassroots thing that comes up from the bottom. But yeah, that's interesting. I love that idea. All right, so we got time for maybe a couple more questions. Here's one about user research efforts. Would you say B2C startups have advantage over B2B startups when it comes to finding users for research, UX research efforts?
Hmm, not particularly, because I think if you're a B2B SaaS, you could also recruit with a pilot company that you choose to work
Mm-hmm.
with. And that could be an amazing way to approach it.
Mm-hmm.
You have a giant pool of interviewees that you can keep picking from if you
Mm-hmm.
have a good pilot program with a particular company or an enterprise. I feel like with B2C, it's easier to recruit interviewees, but it's a little bit harder because they could be all over the place. They can be from many different target user bases, and they can have many different personas. And it's really important that you stay on track with the same persona. So weeding out the individuals that fit within your persona is a little more difficult in a B2C. So I don't particularly think it's easier.
Yeah, I was actually going to say similar. So B2B might be easier because you have a captive audience.
Yeah,
So the business is paying,
exactly.
and so I
Yeah.
know exactly who my user. I know their role. I know everything about
Yeah.
them that I'm legally allowed to capture. Obviously, so for
Yeah.
like with GE, I can say who's my contact at Delta. I need to have a power plant engineer and someone from the sales team or someone from the whatever to come and do a thing, and
Yeah.
they get paid while they're doing it too. So it's like different, I think, for B2C where some random person has to give you 45 minutes or an hour of their time and isn't compensated
Exactly.
for it. So
And they
B2B
might not
might be
be the
easier.
right person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, so that's that. I think that might be the last question. No, did we have any other questions coming in? I think that might have been all of them.
No, I think that's all. Maybe we can take the selfie right now, and then if people have more questions, then we can kind of take the last question before we go. Otherwise, we can probably end the session on time.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Perfect. Do we have a
So
pose for the selfie?
everyone, if you can turn on your camera, and then we'll take the group selfie right now. Um, I see more people turning on their cameras.
Pretty sure nobody here is ugly.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna take the screenshot. 1, 2, 3. Let's do the next page. 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. Do we have any more questions coming in? No, we're all good. Do we all enjoy the session today?
Yeah, this is awesome.
Awesome. Great. Well, in that case, I'm going to stick around for a little bit in case anyone has any last minute thought or anything. But let's give Jeremy and Komal a round of applause. Thank them for a great conversation today. And then hopefully we'll see more group sessions from them in the short time.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Yeah, cool.
guys.
Thanks. Awesome
Well,
insights.
have a great day, everyone.
Hope
Thank
this made you think about something. Thank you.
you, Komal.
Do you
Thank you,
want us to stick
Jeremy.
Take care.
around? Do you want us to
We're
stick around?
good.
Sure.
We can do, yeah, sure. Maybe you want to stick around for a couple of minutes for a
Okay.
retro.
All right. Okay, we'll do that.
I'm going to stop recording for the time being. Thank you, Mashape.